Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar on the National Organic Research Agenda by Dr. Thelma Velez of the Organic Farming Research Foundation. I'm your host, Alice Formiga of eOrganic, and before we start, I just wanted to let you know that we are recording this presentation, and the recording will be available on the eOrganic YouTube channel within the next week, and on our website at eorganic.org, where you can find lots of other publicly available information on organic farming and research. So today, I'm very pleased to welcome Thelma Velez, who is the Research and Education Program Manager at the Organic Farming Research Foundation. She earned a PhD in Environment and Natural Resources from The Ohio State University, and she has more than 15 years of experience in U.S. and international organic agriculture and sustainable food systems, including education, research project management, and diversity and inclusion work.
Thank you, Alice, and hello, everyone. I'm going to be sharing my screen, so I will not be able to see all the wonderful faces that are here, but I am very excited to be presenting the findings of our National Organic Research Agenda. As Alice Formiga said, I am coming today from the Organic Farming Research Foundation, where I am the Research and Education Program Manager, and I'd like to just give a special thanks to Alice for all the opportunities we have to share our findings with the broader public through the eOrganic platform. I'm going to start with a little bit of background about our organization first. For those of you who have not heard of OFRF, we've been around since the 90s, and our mission is to foster the improvement and widespread adoption of organic farming systems. We have a vision that organic becomes the leading form of agriculture across the US, but also across the world, to kind of build out those healthy and resilient economies, ecosystems, and communities. Our work takes a three-pronged approach focused on research and education, and also advocacy. The research and education work falls more within my domain. We have the Organic Research Grant Program, where we offer $20,000 for folks to do research on organic farms. A lot of times these are university researchers, sometimes they're organic farmers, and these collaborative projects. All of the findings from these reports, they can be found in our database, so that information is accessible to the public. We also have our Organic Ag Research Forum that we hold annually in conjunction with other conferences, and then we just engage in a variety of different forms of research and cooperative agreements. In terms of education, we provide free science-based educational materials for farmers and ag professionals. These come in the form of guidebooks. We have courses online through Canvas. So for those who have not been to our website, visit www.ofrf.org. And if you click on research and education, you'll see a variety of free PDFs that you can download to learn more. These are some examples of some of the guidebooks that we've most recently put out into the world. These are mostly focused on soil health and organic farming systems, and there's different ones from cover cropping to weed management, plant genetics, soil carbon sequestration, or water management. And so please visit our website and look at all the resources that we have, share them with people who you think might be able to use them. As I did mention, part of our research also is in collaborations with organizations such as NRCS, where we are helping to provide resources to help equip them to better support organic growers while they're working on their conservation programs. We also have a cooperative agreement with USDA NIFA, so we are looking at their OREI and ORG funding and looking to see how that aligns with the National Organic Standard Board priorities and also priorities in our previous National Organic Research Agenda as well. And then I mentioned that advocacy is a big part of the work that we do as well. In this photo, you'll see smiling up front is our wonderful executive director, Breeze Tenser, and Breeze is extremely passionate about advocating for more federal dollars to be set aside for organic farming systems and supporting research, education, and policies that can get more acreage into organic production. We also have a policy and program manager, Gordon Merrick, who's also going to be doing a lot of this work as well. So some background on our NORA reports. We do a national survey roughly every 5 or 6 years. Our previous report was released in 2016, and we consider these surveys and the findings of these surveys to be the most robust reporting of these challenges that are faced by U.S. producers, organic producers to date. And a lot of the findings in this report just become a roadmap for us as an organization, but also for other researchers to look at what are the challenges that growers are facing so that that can inform the research that they're doing, and then also a place for us to approach Congress and the USDA and advocate for more support to address these challenges and needs that growers have. So on to this report, the 2022 NORA report, we did in conjunction with the Organic Seed Alliance. That was one of our partners. So for those of you who have not heard of the OSA seed report, State of the Seed, they will be presenting their findings. I believe it's on the 17th. So soon after this one through eOrganics as well. You can find more of their findings in this webinar, but our joint survey captured over 1,000 survey respondents. We sent it out to certified organic growers across the nation. We also engaged in 16 focus groups in different regions. And then we also have a smaller pool of transitioning growers as well. And those are the findings that we present in this report. The report is broken down primarily into 5 chapters. The first chapter, we go through farmer-rancher demographics and farm characteristics. In the second chapter, we want to highlight the great practices that organic growers are already engaging in. Soil health practices, water conservation, and we lightly touch on organic seed use, but the best place for that would be to go through the Organic Seed Alliance's report to see the richer findings. In chapter 3, this is the meatiest of all of the chapters. And this is where we ask growers, what are their biggest challenges, both production, non-production challenges. We ask them what were their technical assistance needs and the concerns that they had with respect to organic agriculture. In chapter 4, we ask them about their preferred sources of information, the way they like to receive their information in different formats, and then some suggested solutions. The chapter 5 is based on all of those findings that we have. These are OFRF recommendations and priorities that we think are the things that come to the forefront from this report. So you can download the report at ofrf.org/research/NORA. And I believe that is also plugged into the chat. So I'll dive right in. In the first chapter, we look at the demographics. Of course, farmers are generally an older population. Roughly 60% were over the age of 54. That is similar for both conventional and organic growers as well. Farming is also predominantly white enterprise. 96% of our respondents identified as white, 4% identified as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. And then in terms of farming experience, more than 3/4 of these growers that responded to our survey said that they have 10+ years of experience, and about 1/4 said they have less than 10 years of experience. This is a map of survey respondents, and I apologize that Alaska got cut off there. I'm not sure why, but you can see here that California had the biggest group of respondents, but within the Pacific Northwest, we do have a lot of organic growers. If you see in the Great Lakes region as well, in the Northeast, Texas showed up pretty well, but in general, like this central area here and the South doesn't have as much as we would have hoped, but it does closely mirror the NAS data, so the USDA census data. In our report, we broke down our findings based on commodities, where we combine vegetable, herbs, and flowers into a category: field crops, tree and vine crops, livestock and dairy, forage crops, berries, and seeds for planting. So you can see the percentages of who responded, who's growing or producing these products. Of course, it does not add to 100% because there are folks who are doing more than one of these or several of these. We also looked at the data by SARE region, and we also looked at it by ag eco region, and I'll get into that a little bit later. This slide is really to share our comparison, so the comparison between our survey population and our sample size, and then this is the sample of certified organic farmers from the 2019 NAS organic survey data. And what I want to highlight here is that our sample is quite representative. We're off at most by 2%. If you look at the SARE region here in the Northeast, Northeast was 22% in our survey, but it's 24% in the NAS survey. 35 and 35 for North Central. Western is off by 2%, but we did a really good job at capturing folks across the nation, and I'm very proud of that work that we did. This is just an image to show the SARE breakdown for those who may not be familiar with it. The yellow here is the Western SARE region, the green is the North Central, the Northeast is here in the orange, and then the Southern region is this bigger dark blue section. We also broke down our findings by ag eco region, and these were based on 10 USDA production regions that were originally proposed in Ayler et al.'s paper. And we would have loved to have used 10 production regions, but we didn't have enough respondents in each of these regions. So what we have it broken down into is the Pacific. We merged the Great Plains and Mountains, the Great Lakes region. We have the Corn Belt, the Northeast, and the South region as well. And I'll show you more about those differences later when we get into the production challenges. This is a busy slide, and I apologize for that in advance, but really the big takeaway here is that we looked at the commodities grown by ag ecoregion. So if you'll see the Northeast, which is that first box, you'll see that vegetables, herbs, and cut flowers were produced by 43% of respondents in that region. If you look at the box next to it, the Corn Belt region, field crops were produced by 67% of respondents in that region. So this is just to give a breakdown of what's being grown within each ag ecoregion. Vegetable, herbs, and flowers are the top commodity being produced in the South and the Northeast, and it ranked second in the Pacific. The Pacific does lead the way in terms of tree and vine crops. Those are 59% of respondents in that region said that that's what they were working on, followed by the South, which was 22%. The South and the Pacific lead in terms of berry production, and then field crops, of course, dominate in the Corn Belt and the Great Plains and in the Great Lakes. And when it comes to livestock and dairy, the Northeast, Corn Belt, and Great Lakes, as well as so that's in terms of livestock and dairy, but then that's similar numbers for forages. And you'll see more of this information when we start looking at the challenges or the particular inputs that are being used. This is just a map of where our transitioning respondents were. Like I said, we didn't get respondents from across the US as much as we had hoped, but there's still a lot of information that we can share, and findings are still pretty telling. So these are the transitioning growers broken down by commodity, SARE region, and ag ecoregion. And then I'm just gonna add this little box here. This is the certified organic respondents, the same levels. So you'll see that for those who are transitioning, 50% of them are focusing on vegetable, herbs, and flowers versus 37% of those who are already certified. And so you can see a breakdown and a shift. And so there's more livestock and dairy now for those who are transitioning than for those who are already certified. And then in terms of the regions where folks are transitioning, we see here in the Northeast, 16% were from the Northeast. And that is telling because the Northeast has a lot of opportunities to support transitioning growers, which means those programs are working. We also asked the growers, the transitioning growers, what were their motivations? Why are they trying to get into organic agriculture? Why are they trying to seek certification? And of course, 98%, that's almost all of them, or those who responded to this question, said that they're concerned about the environment and biodiversity. There are those who said they're concerned about the sustainability of their farm. They want to enhance their farm sustainability. For some, it's personal. Family values, they're concerned about human health, and all of these, with the exception of the last one, they're over 50%. And so having a specific market opportunity or a contract from a buyer, that is not one of the primary motivating factors. And I highlight that because in the next slide, you'll see these are the marketing region or the scale at which organic, certified organic, and transitioning growers are where they're selling. And so those who are already certified organic, they're selling locally, right? Primarily 64% are selling locally, but they're also getting into these regional and national markets. But those who are just transitioning are really kind of feeling it. They're stuck in this local area. They're trying to get into more regional and national markets. And the same goes for, their primary marketing outlet. So those who are transitioning are mostly selling direct to consumer, not so much to wholesale, versus those who are already certified, almost half of them are selling wholesale. And then a little bit, almost 30% are selling direct to consumer. There are some who are doing direct to retail or food hubs and cooperatives. And so these opportunities for accessing markets is really important. In the second chapter I mentioned, we really wanted to highlight the environmental stewardship practices that these organic growers and transitioning growers are engaging in, whether it's soil health management practices, water conservation, or what kind of inputs they're using. And what we found is, not surprising, these growers are leading the way in terms of soil and climate stewardship practices. And one example of that is cover crops and green manures were used by 88% of survey respondents, with almost half saying that they cover crop very often. And that is compared to just about 10% of non-organic producers planting cover crops, according to census data from 2012. And there was a slight increase for that in the following census. So these are the soil health management practices that we asked about. Cover cropping and green manures, which you see I mentioned, almost half said that they do it very often, but here you see 88% do it at least to some extent. Crop rotation was the most commonly practiced of the three, and then intercropping, which tends to be more complicated, not just in terms of execution, but also even just documentation and record keeping. That is the most challenging practice of those. We looked at these soil health management practices by ag ecoregions and seroregion as well. In the report, in the body of it, we have the ag ecoregions, but in the supplemental section of the report, you'll see the seroregion as well. And here you'll see there are some regions that are engaging in crop rotations more than others. For example, in the Corn Belt or in the Great Lakes or in the South, right? And that makes sense based on field crops or the commodities that are being produced. And then we'll see in the Pacific, there's less crop rotations, but we also know that there are more tree and vine crops. So it's a little bit more difficult to do crop rotations for those established commodities. We also looked at farming experience. And so there's not huge differences in terms of, for example, crop rotation between beginning or experienced growers. But we do see that experienced growers are practicing these slightly more so than those who are just beginning, which means that they are feeling more comfortable in their operations, or perhaps are more established and able to kind of trial out new techniques. Interestingly, those who are transitioning are actually practicing all of these even more so than our certified organic growers already. So they're coming into it knowing that, you know, they really want to work on crop rotation, being more diverse, and having their cover crops and their intercropping. This is the greatest out of all of those. We also asked the survey respondents what kind of inputs they were using on their operations. So we asked them about composting, compost teas, manure, and organic fertilizers. The least is obviously compost teas. This is more of an intricate practice that requires steeping the compost. But we do see that, you know, there's still a good deal of compost and manure being applied, and I'll show you the regional breakdown of that is interesting as well. And then you'll see the transitioning growers are relying on these even more so. And part of that is that I'm sure they're trying to learn how to build their soil health and make their soil and build that soil organic matter as much as possible to increase their yields. So when we look at the ag ecoregions, this is what I was saying was interesting is you can see, for example, manure is being applied by more than half of the folks in the Corn Belt very often, but more than 3/4 are applying it at least often, and just 94% are applying it to some extent. But that makes sense because there's a lot of livestock and dairy within these regions, in the Great Lakes region as well, and in the Northeast. And then we'll see that, for example, organic fertilizers are being applied at the highest rate in the South. And so that is something that I know has been brought up in the past, like why are they using less compost and more organic fertilizers? And part of that has to do with just the heat and the how quickly everything mineralizes. We also asked about water conservation practices. This is, I'm only including these two with respect to water conservation, just looking at a breakdown by commodity and also by region. You'll see here in terms of commodity, berries, there are more folks who are growing berries that are concerned with water conservation, but part of that overlaps with, for example, berry production is also happening a lot in the Pacific. And we know in the Pacific, here's the greatest the region with the greatest concern for water conservation, with the exception of the South here. That is because they are constantly within a drought. And so there is overlap within these breakdowns and these cross tabulations. All right, so I'm going to jump into chapter 3, and this is, as I said, the media's chapter. We broke down the challenges, both production, non-production challenges, and their technical assistance needs and their concerns. In this particular excerpt of the report, those top 5 production challenges are what we focused on in the narrative, and those are controlling weeds, which is not a big surprise for organic growers, managing production costs, maintaining adequate yields, managing soil fertility and crop nutrition, and controlling insect pests. Of course, still finding appropriate crop varieties and controlling disease pressure or climate change, those are still pressing concerns, but these are the top 5. So this is where I said there's more reason for us to look at not just a SARE regional breakdown, but also an ag eco-regional breakdown. In the SARE region, when you look at this data, those top 5 challenges are almost mirrored across each region, with the exception of the southern region, where controlling disease pressure and finding appropriate crop varieties and seed for your operation emerge. But when you look at ag eco-region, then you begin to see more of these nuances. For example, so in the South, controlling disease pressure and appropriate crop varieties is still in those top 5. But then in the Great Lakes, we see adapting to climate change is one of the top 5 challenges. Or in the Corn Belt, minimizing the adverse impacts of tillage, right? This is a region that is predominantly growing field crops and perhaps growing field crops at a larger scale. And so these growers are really trying to figure out the best ways to minimize the adverse impacts of tillage. And then, for example, in the Great Plains, now you also see that finding appropriate crop varieties emerging or controlling disease pressure in the Pacific region. In this report, we, for the first time, also looked at BIPOC challenges, so the challenges that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are facing compared to non-BIPOC folks. Very interestingly, but not surprisingly for folks who do research in this area, is that every production challenge is rated substantial by a greater percent of BIPOC respondents than non-BIPOC folks. These are differences of up to 24% with respect to the production challenges. And so you'll see, for example, managing production costs is 81% for BIPOC organic growers versus 57% for their non-BIPOC counterparts, or 72% are saying controlling weeds. That's not the biggest difference, but each of these are substantially higher, and also controlling disease pressure is one that emerged. We do address this in this report. We do have a section that discusses structural racism and inequities, a history of inequity within the USDA, and we make recommendations for addressing that as well. Some people have told me, well, maybe these BIPOC challenges is just because these BIPOC folks are newer and they're not as experienced. And to that I say, well, when we look at experience farming, beginning farmers and experienced farmers are not too far off in these challenges that they face, right? 66% compared to 67, or 63 compared to 56. These challenges are not as big. That's not to say that beginning farmers are not facing these challenges at a slightly higher rate, but they're not experiencing it to the same rate that their BIPOC counterparts are. When we asked transitioning growers what their production challenges were, several of them mirrored the overall controlling weeds or managing production costs, thinking about finding organic crop varieties or seed that are appropriate for their operations. Tied for 5th was seed saving or seed production, which had not emerged in the others as a top 5. Managing soil fertility did, and then adapting to climate change. And so it's interesting to see that these transitioning growers are already thinking about how to build resilience within their operations despite being new. In the report, we supplement all of our quantitative findings with qualitative data from our focus group and open-ended questions within our survey. We will see, so these percentages at the top here, that #1 production challenge being weeds, 67%. The first is the certified organic. The second percentage number is the transitioning growers. So 67 and 77% said that weeds is a big challenge. And there were folks who said, I would like to see more research, not on how to kill weeds, but how to discourage them from germinating in the first place. Or, people said that their biggest issue is perennial weeds. We heard a lot about bindweed and Canadian thistle, which came up a lot in these conversations. We had folks who say they want to figure out ways to identify pre and post-emergent herbicides, right? So thinking outside of the norm. Managing production costs, people said they need less expensive organic inputs. People said they recognize that farming is such a high capital and low revenue business. They'd like to see more grant programs where the government is getting more involved with redistributing resources. Maintaining adequate yields. This is this is really important for any farming operation. When we think about it in terms of each of these top 5 production challenges, they're very much overlapping, such that, this idea of maintaining adequate yields is also tied to building the soil, right? How do you build the soil to keep up sustainable yields? Or people are saying like they're having trouble getting enough yield to break even over input costs. Well, the previous challenge was talking about managing production costs and inputs. And so there's a lot of overlap within all of these challenges. So here we have managing soil fertility, where folks say, we're really in the business of growing and building our soil. And people are just saying soil is very important. It's the building block of everything else. And this is more specific to farmers than ranchers for some cases, except those focusing more on forage. But these challenges are very real. Of course, there's also the controlling insect or arthropod pests. Some folks were saying that, there's an ever increasing new roster of pests and diseases that, that it's just becoming more and more difficult to keep up with these, and the pest complexes are changing. The next thing I wanted to focus on are those non-production challenges. The top 5 non-production challenges were accessing labor, finding and developing markets for organic products, the cost of organic certification, meeting record-keeping requirements, and developing infrastructure. And you can see those last 3 were tied. When we look at these non-production challenges by SEER region, we can see that those in the Northeast region reported the fewest challenges in terms of percentages here. So 36% compared to 61% in the South for accessing labor, or 55% in the Western region. And so we know that the challenges are still shared to some extent, but certain regions are feeling it more than others. Again, when we look at the BIPOC challenges for non-production, every challenge is felt at a higher level. These are differences of 11 to 32% in some cases. And you'll see, for example, that accessing capital or the cost of organic certification is felt significantly stronger, right? 61% said cost of certification compared to 29%. And so there are some big differences. Again, this is not just because BIPOC folks are new to organic farming. When we look at experience, those differences are not off by 11 or 30%. For beginning farmers, we do see that accessing capital and financing is a challenge for them. And then, of course, for experienced farmers now, we have farm succession planning emerge as a challenge. And that is a very real challenge for those who have been farming for decades and want to make sure that their farming operations or their ranching operations continue to produce and stay within an agricultural setting. These are challenges that experienced growers are facing as well. When we asked transitioning growers what their non-production challenges, they were closely mirrored to some extent here: finding and developing markets. It was still meeting record-keeping requirements, developing infrastructure, accessing labor, and then accessing capital and financing. So again, those percentages at the top are just the first number is the organic, the certified organic, and then the second number is the transitioning growers. People were saying that they're struggling to find labor that is qualified, or people that can help on a regular basis. But then at the same time, you need people on a regular basis, but only a couple days a week for a short period of time. Some people talked about having more friendly guest worker programs, and this is one of the biggest challenges for farming operations. Finding and developing markets, there's a big difference between the certified organic growers and those transitioning growers, which is kind of what you saw in that pie chart that I showed early on. Folks are struggling to find out, how to access these more regional markets, or even, throughout the pandemic, right? I have to recognize that this survey was conducted and the pandemic was picking up and then in full swing. Like, there's a lot of challenges with getting out and marketing your product when everything was on lockdown. We did have people saying, like, I can't sell the produce I grow. There's not enough organic farmers. They can't fill a train carload. They need to co-op. Other folks said they need to identify regional marketing opportunities where small growers can serve, to aggregate and have cooperatives or food hubs. This is a very interesting quote with the arrow at the bottom for me, because, this person said, like, what tools and technologies can best serve micro and small farms trying to sell online or provide delivery services? And to me, these are the kinds of questions that researchers, whether it's marketing or economic researchers, can start engaging in to really dig into how to build a more sustainable organic food system. Is it economically feasible for micro farms and smart farms to do this kind of work? And then what are the kind of trainings that can be made available to help them? Record keeping and cost of certification, these are two really big challenges. I highly recommend that you dig into the report for this. We have some case studies from the focus groups that popped up. I'll just read and paraphrase some of the second quote here, where this grower said that the hardest part of certification is when the certifier is asking you to basically trace a crop. And in their situation, they had 150 different crops, and within those crops they have 3 or 4 lettuce mixes or that they're planting every week, and they have 30 successions. And someone said, how am I going to trace my 3rd or 4th basil succession back to seed? Or people said, the biggest issue is when they're trying to scale up, and then having those who are working on the farm record keeping and making sure that they're maintaining those records and keeping up to date with it. Transitioning growers said the same thing. A big hurdle to transitioning is that fear of paperwork. Someone gave a good shout out to the Ohio Ecological Food and Farming Association. They said that they've been really helpful and great, but despite this person having help from OFA and then also having 15 years of experience in different capacities on organic farms, they were still struggling to understand what is and what is not acceptable according to NLP rules. The next thing that I wanted to get into was technical assistance needs. So we did ask the growers what were their technical assistance needs and how well were their needs being met. We did combine weed, pest, and disease management into one, because in previous reports, we know if we separate them, well, then those just become the top 3 challenges. So, and technical assistance needs. So 74% said that they wanted technical assistance with organic weed, pest, and disease management. 65% said they wanted help with soil fertility or management of crop nutrients. 60% said soil conservation and soil health. And then, of course, 54% said securing sales channels, right? And that production assistance. When we asked them how well their needs were being met, unfortunately, only 18% said that their needs were being met very well. 53% said somewhat well, and then the rest said that either they weren't sure or it wasn't very well. And that tells us that we need more service providers, technicians, extension agents, and specialists that can help growers. We asked growers about their concerns with respect to organic agriculture. And this was a very striking finding for me, though it's not entirely surprising, but 77% said that their biggest concern was organic fraud and integrity of the label, followed by industrial organic or crop contamination, including GMO, pesticide, or herbicide drift, imbalance of domestic supply and demand, and then tied for 5th was lack of skilled laborers, and then the availability of organic research funds or research being done specifically for organic operations. I highlighted in this box those 3 because it's important to note that these are still very relevant. More than half of folks said that they are concerned about having access to agricultural service providers who are knowledgeable about certified organic systems or animal welfare or adapting to climate change. So these are very, very real concerns for growers. With respect to organic integrity and fraud, someone said, I'm really concerned about the future of organic. I don't know if the integrity has been lost. I know some of my neighbors are cheating and I turn them in. Nothing has been done. Other folks said, we have this discussion with a lot of people who will not be certified because they think it's been co-opted or watered down. With respect to international, right, this domestic imbalance, people said, they're concerned with fraudulent imports of so-called organics. You don't know whether the stuff coming from another country is raised or if it's even raised organically, and to what extent that aligns with the USDA regulations and oversight. In this next slide, I highlight climate change because despite the fact that only 36% of respondents said it was a top production challenge for them, over half reported it as a substantial concern. And of course, it's not the main production challenge. There are more tangible, real production challenges like dealing with weeds or pests or building soil health or finding markets or anything along those lines. But it is still something that came up a lot in our focus groups. Again, someone said, how can we make our farming systems more resilient in the face of climate change? Another person said, we need to address climate change or this entire questionnaire is pointless. Someone else said that they're trying to diversify their farm because they recognize that that's a critical element of resilience, but then they're also struggling with how do you implement all of these mini ecosystems on a farm to make it more diversified and resilient at the same time. And so it's a double-edged sword, and also the reporting that comes with that and the record keeping is greater. We asked growers what were their preferred sources of information? And this is important for us as an organization because we are providing resources for organic farmers or any farmer interested in growing more sustainably. We are providing these resources. So the preferred source of information is other certified organic farmers. That is the number one, followed by other farmers, their online resources, organic certifiers, crop consultants, and extension personnel, specifically saying those who are focused on organic production, and then nonprofit organization following that. You can see the quotes that match that very closely. I find the best thing I have is fellow organic farmers. Someone said, and farm visits, right? It's really helpful to have these smaller farmer groups where it's just 6 farmers and they get together a couple times over winter. People say, I find always in my experience that the best place to go for farming advice is other farmers. We asked BIPOC growers, what are their preferred sources of information? Same thing. Certified organic farmers, other farmers, they said extension personnel focused on organic production. And so these are very important findings for us to figure out how can we either build farmer-to-farmer networks or develop some kind of network to support that learning and that cross-pollination. And then experienced farmers said the same thing for the most part, although I'm going to highlight this arrow here. Beginning farmers also said that they look to nonprofit agriculture organizations, right? Or these online resources, and that's where OFRF fits in as well. Same thing with transitioning growers. They're looking for online resources, nonprofit agriculture organizations. And so for us, that's really important to see that, you know, we have a space to provide transitioning growers with the information that they may need. We also asked them about their preferred formats of information, and that is, of course, part of it may be a generational divide, but printed materials, 65% said that that is their preferred source of information. I also love printed materials, despite the sustainability or unsustainable aspect of it, followed by on-farm demonstrations and field days. So 63% said that those on-farm demonstrations and field days are critical learning opportunities for them. That's how they want to receive that, or conferences and workshops. And then again, online materials. And so those on-farm demonstrations are critical, and we lost a lot of that for the past 2 years because of the pandemic. BIPOC growers said the same thing. On-farm demonstrations, 85% of them said that that is their preferred format of receiving information, followed by, again, printed materials and then online videos. And then experienced growers, those experienced growers, they like the printed materials, email newsletters and groups. So that tells me that these experienced growers, they're more plugged in to listservs and groups, and these beginning growers may not have that same resource. So the last section of the report is really just recommendations that OFRF developed on all of these findings. Our main takeaway is that we need to increase organic research funding to reflect, right, how much organic production is of the US market share. We know that OREI and ORG, they have research dollars and education and extension funding, but we want more because organic growers need it. In this section of the report, this is just to give an idea of what it looks like. For example, we'll give an example, integrated weed management, and then there's a few bullets that kind of say these are suggestions for how we can do that. You know, do we want to develop new non-soil disturbing technologies that can help with weed control? For example, in the IPM, integrated pest management, right? We know that IPM has been around a long time, but you know, we need to develop those integrated pest managements specifically with NOP allowed materials as well. And then managing production costs. There's different, cost analysis or enterprise budgeting for specialty crops or diversified vegetable rotations, perennial horticultural cropping systems. These are just recommendations, and we welcome feedback on any of these for those who want to dig into the report. We also want to translate this research into practice. How can we better disseminate research outcomes and findings, educational materials for those who need it? We heard a lot about developing centralized location for organic information resources, and we do know that there are organizations that do that. And so how can we better build out those resources so that there is a clearinghouse where growers can go as opposed to, piecemealing information? And then also translating, building out these farmer-to-farmer learning opportunities and building out the capacity of extension agents and specialists, right, or NRCS and other ag professionals to better serve the organic farming sector. That's something that I think is a critical need, and us as an organization we're pursuing. And how can we better provide training and technical assistance for those transitioning and beginning growers? So I'm going to end there. Thank you all for listening. Again, if you want to download the report, I highly recommend you do at ofrf.org/research/NORA.
Wow, thank you, Thelma. That was so much information packed into 40 minutes, very concisely. We do have some questions coming in, so I'm just going to get started here. The first question is, were the survey respondents required to be actually certified organic, or did the results also include farmers who farm with organic practices but aren't actually certified?
Thank you for your question, Megan. Yes, all of those that are included within the survey had to be certified organic. We wanted to make sure that we were capturing those who were certified organic and then those who were transitioning or interested in transitioning to the certification.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so here's a comment, or actually a question from Mark Schoenbeck, who also works for the Organic Farming Research Foundation. He wonders if the hotspots for transitioning respondents correspond with the states or areas with the greatest support from NGOs or other government support for organic transition, like Iowa, Oregon, Washington, Minnesota, and a couple of northeastern states. Had several transitioning respondents, while California had only one, and much of the South and Great Plains had 0 to 1 per state.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think that's a really good point that you bring up. And that's why I said, I noticed that for me, looking at those findings, the Northeast had, a higher percentage of those who were transitioning. And I know that there are better mechanisms to help folks transition, but that's a question for us to dig into, to kind of recognize, like, we're, as an organization, we're not extremely just giving all of our attention to those who are transitioning. And so we can partner with other organizations to kind of look around and figure out, are these the states that are providing better support for transitioning or providing those resources? And is that probably the reason why that is happening?
Did you have data on soil health practices by the size of the farm?
Yeah, I think I saw that question pop up. Was that Charlotte?
Yeah, that was Charlotte.
Yeah, so Charlotte, we have the data, but we did not analyze it by that. So because of just budget limitations, we had to kind of prioritize. We do have not just the breakdown of, we asked farmers and growers, we asked them the size of their operation, and we also asked them if they were landowners or if they were leasing. So we have the data, but we would need to acquire additional funding to run analysis to break that down. But those are questions that we are all really thinking about digging into, because we do know that soil health practices, one, by the size of an operation, are really important, and also whether or not the folks own the land to make that investment versus lease the land is something that may be informative.
Did you track that as well, whether they own or lease the land?
Yeah, so we asked them if they own or they lease, and we asked them the size of their operation. So the data is there. If there's anyone out there who wants to fund additional research, we can do that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, what do you recommend for farmers who might wish to make all or part of their organic acreage available for a research project? Whom should they contact?
Oh, that's a good question, Karen. So I highly recommend, for example, there's two approaches. One, if you have particular questions that you want addressed, you could go to folks at your land grant institution and say, like, I'm looking for, maybe a graduate student that could help me explore this. And a lot of graduate students are always looking for projects that they can undertake, but then also even just approaching those researchers as well and saying, I have organic acreage available. Are there research projects that you want to trial on organic land? And then, of course, make sure that you're fairly compensated for that as well, because if you're taking land out of production for research, you should receive compensation. In our grant program, we require any research being done to happen on certified organic land. And most of those applications are either the farmer approached a researcher and asked them, to help them answer a question, or university researchers were looking for organic growers so that they could trial their products on. So I highly recommend you, touch base with folks at different institutions that are close to your area, and they may be looking for organic acreage to do that. And then Karen, also, if you want to reach out to me personally, Thelma at OFRF.org. So maybe we can have a conversation also about other opportunities.
Okay, great. Okay, so here's a question from Brian. Most agricultural research funding now comes from the private sector. Technology development and transfer is also regarded as primarily a private sector endeavor. Did anything come up in the survey or the focus groups about how to increase the share of private sector funded research, development, and technology transfer to benefit organic farmers?
Thanks, Brian, for your question. Nice to see you popping on here. I don't have the answer to that. I would have to really dig into the report and the findings as well. To my recollection from reviewing the focus groups, that's not something that necessarily came up. There was attention drawn to a lack of research being done on particular cultivars or plant breeding, but it's not where I recall from, off the top of my head, that people were saying like private sector is what we should be approaching in terms of developing newer technologies for the benefit of organic farmers.
Oh, here's a comment back to the question from Karen about how a farmer could connect with a research project. From James here, he notes that the Northeast SARE program, for example, offers grower grants for research, and they often involve a university mentor. So, okay, here's a question. It says, please speak to FDA and USDA and possibly state agencies sampling of organic foods for pesticide residual violations, and when any violations are found, what about enforcement specifically for imported foods and beverages? So,
yeah, thank you, Richard, for your question. I have less information specifically on how the USDA and FDA sample organic foods. What is their process for looking for residual pesticides and how they might address those violations? That's not something that I necessarily have focused my attention to, but that is something that comes up a lot in these surveys as well, right? When we're thinking about what is the enforcement for violations, and of course also whether it's domestic or imported. I do not have a good answer for you on that. That's something that I could dig into if you were interested in, but it wouldn't be from this report. It would just be more a broader answer.
High levels of cover crop rotation, intercropping, and organic amendment use by transitioning growers suggest that soil and agroecosystem health is a major motivating factor for farmers to undertake transition at this time. Does this seem true? And he says he's an insider here, but yeah, he just wants to know what you think about that. I mean, I know farmers are required to transition their land, and plant cover crops and that kind of thing during the transition process. But what do you think of what Mark said?
I mean, Mark, when you look at the transitioning motivations, right, the percent of folks who said enhancement of farm environmental sustainability, that was 97% of folks who said that. And so they are thinking about soil health and agroecological health or agroecosystem health on their operations in a holistic perspective. And I think that's something that really stands out to me in terms of these transitioning growers, that they're not just thinking about it in terms of profit or entering that market. It's really just a big picture sustainability vision for them.
So if the goal is organic, for organic research funding to be proportional to its market share, how far away are we from that?
Thank you, Jane. I think my most up-to-date information is I think we're at 2%, and the market share is 6% so organic is 6% of the market share. And then we have about 2% of federal dollars for funding. And I might be a little bit off on that, but I think that's where we are at right now. At least that's where we were last year.
Okay, great. Thank you. Here's just a question, general question from Sylvia about what you mean by transitional organic. Do you mean farmers that are in the process of transitioning to organic production.
Correct. Yes, Sylvia. So those are folks who are to become certified organic. There is a transitional period of a few years, and in those few years, they have to take land out of conventional production and make sure that there are, for example, buffers separating the land they're trying to certify organic from their conventional production land. And so that is a several-year process that that they must undertake before they can receive organic certification. So that means that they're no longer applying certain inputs and they're engaging in other soil health practices to prepare their land for organic certification.
In regard to that question about enforcement, accredited certifiers are required to sample at least 5% of their operations for pesticide residues. If positive detections are found, it must be acted upon. NOP is notified when the notices of noncompliance are generated, and certifiers are also required to notify other relevant state or federal agencies.
Thank you, Eric. That was really insightful. I appreciate you adding that information. And I think a follow-up question to that some growers might have and some folks might say is, what happens after that notice of noncompliance goes out? And what's the follow-up to remedy that as well?
So here's another comment from Mark here. He said, it's good to see that the 97% motivation for agroecosystem health is backed by higher rates of soil health practices in transition. They put their money where their mouths are. Here's another question from Gamadala. If we want to release an organic pesticides into the market, what are the tests and protocols to be followed?
Wow, Kamadila, I'm not entirely sure what the procedure is for industry or for folks who are interested in capitalizing one of their products. I'm not sure if maybe there's someone on this call that can answer that. Maybe Eric might have some insight to that. I've not actually reviewed what the process and protocol is when an entity or an organization or an individual wants to develop an organic pesticide. And then, so that would be the OMRI, as Jane Subi said. And then of course, I'm not entirely sure what the whole process would be. Okay. There's someone here, Pam Marone, who said, how to get a new organic product approved, please message me on LinkedIn. Pam Marone.
That's very nice. Thank you, Pam. Okay, here's another question from Emily. What is your insight into the emergence of carbon credit for agricultural projects, and how can farmers or ranchers get involved with this?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm wondering if I might be able to hand this question over to Mark Schoenbeck, who's been he's been digging into more of this carbon credit and carbon sequestration aspect of our research. Mark, would you be able to address Emily's question? What are insights on emergence of carbon credits for ag projects and how ranchers and farmers might be able to get involved with it?
Well, that's a big question because there are a lot of concerns with the carbon market itself in that, well, I'll just outline two of the many concerns. One is it's extremely hard to quantify at this point how much carbon is actually being sequestered in the soil. You get a one farming system that does everything right, it's an integrated system, and they're putting half a ton of carbon in the soil every year, in fact, and then another one does just the same set of good practices, but for a lot of reasons that are beyond their control, it doesn't really change the actual carbon level, maybe just maintain it. So it's very hard to quantify and nail down how much carbon is being sequestered. The other problem is that the markets that have been available to date really don't pay the farmer nearly enough. Like simply planting a cover crop can increase your cost $50 an acre. And if you're paying only $15 a ton for carbon dioxide, that's maybe $55 a ton for carbon. Most annual cover crops will only put a fraction of a ton in the soil in 1 year. So thus far, the markets that are out there aren't really paying farmers enough even to compensate the cost of the added practices. And the third thing is, if we're going to let industry pay farmers to farm better so that they can go on polluting, it's at best a zero-sum gain. That's only if the carbon sequestration is equal to what the models suggest. And again, there's that uncertainty factor. I totally support farmers getting paid for taking good care of the land. I think that's the purpose of the government, of the conservation programs. I am speaking from my own opinion here, but it's an opinion that is shared to varying degrees by others in the organic field, in the sustainable field. And there are others who are more positive about carbon markets. And it's an ongoing debate. But I think that the first step we need to take is say, okay, it is a public good to take care of the land, to keep the soil on the farm, to keep the water clean, and to maintain the highest level of soil health for long-term resilience. And yes, some of these practices will help take some carbon out of the atmosphere. But we really, in the long run, just have to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels to the point where emissions are way down. We can't expect organic farmers or even conservation farmers, whether or not they use pesticides, to clean up our whole greenhouse gas footprint. It's, yeah, I think I'm more interested in seeing farmers truly supported for the whole gamut of ecosystem services, rather than focusing on specifically how much carbon they can pack on their soil when it is such a slippery quantity and also not always permanent.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Mark, for that. Meanwhile, we have also had some of our attendees, Richard and Eric, contributed some answers to the questions about approval of new products. So Richard said that they're mostly handled by OMRI, which is a private certifier organization headquartered in Oregon, and USDA sets the standards but doesn't certify products. And then Eric said but for a new material, the best thing would be to approach one of the recognized material review organizations like OMRI, PCO, or WSDA. And before use, someone will have to do a proper review, and this is not always easy for individual accredited certifiers to do. So thank you both for contributing some help with that question here. We have a couple more questions here. Did you ask any questions about crop livestock integration in the survey?
So we did not specifically ask about crop livestock integration, but it did come up within our focus groups. And I think a lot of what we heard was some people were saying, you know, the fact that farm animals were removed from farms, that is a huge detriment to farm operations. Others said that integrating crops or integrating livestock back into their operations has really built out their fertility for their soil, but then also provided new revenue streams. And so that is something that did come up in our focus groups, and it is in the report under farmer identified solutions, I think.
Okay, great. And we have one last question here from Sadana, who wondered, did your survey include or address any aspects of food safety in organic production?
Thank you for the question. So we didn't focus primarily on food safety, but we did address that. We had that embedded within our non-production challenges. So we did ask them if understanding and following food safety standards was a non-production challenge for them. In terms of the findings, that was usually one of the lower ranked of those. And I think sometimes that might just be a case of the region or the types of commodities that are being produced, but it was not one of the top challenges that was identified in the report. But we did ask if that was one of their non-production challenges.
Okay, great. It looks like we don't have any more questions at this time, but I definitely want to thank you all for all the questions. And I'd like to thank you so much, Thelma, for this excellent and concise presentation where you talked about so much in such a short time, but I know that there will be many of you listening who would like to dig a little deeper into the data. So you can find the NORA report at the link that I just, thanks again so much, Thelma, and thanks to everyone for joining us today.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. Thank you everyone for the great questions and for tuning in.